I'm afraid it will be easier and probably more comprehensible in English. I want to thank the organizers and to previous two speakers. They emphasized several points which are very valid to the picture I'm going to draw in many different ways. But also I should say that I approach the issue rather as a maybe civic activist than as a researcher, just because my NGO was involved, my group, it was an initiative and then it developed into a non-governmental organization, dealt with assistance to refugees who sought asylum in Ukraine and with issues of non-discrimination, and currently we also work with internally displaced persons assistance. And freedom of movement is therefore one of our main interests. Well, you know, the name of organization, No Borders, I think says a lot about it. A lot of things which were mentioned by Sabine are very familiar to me with some time shift, because I'm a Soviet kid, I was raised in Soviet Union, and I remember that in late Soviet Union part of education for kids was this mythology about the border, and some of the heroes in this pantheon of Soviet heroes were Soviet border guards with their loyal and nice dogs, of course, who protected the border. And and there was this expression, the border is tightly locked, граница на замке. So like we're all protected. The border was perceived as a military institution, but first and foremost as an ideological and political one, and it was an issue of security, which was at the center of popular mythology, at least for kids. We knew that as long as these popular heroes, Soviet border guards with their dogs, are standing at the Soviet external border, we can sleep tight, we're all protected. It's about security, because borderline separates good from evil, separates different systems of values, separates different worlds, basically, where our world is constantly under potential attack from the outside. On the other hand, of course, the border in popular mythology, especially for those who did not go into any deeper analysis or who didn't have any particular life experience related to the borders, who lived more deeply in the heartland of Soviet republics. The border enclosing the whole Soviet Union formed the universe of its own. To go beyond the border, to cross it, even into the territories of the friendly Soviet states like Poland and Czechoslovakia and Hungary, leaving alone German Democratic Republic, was really tough, was next to impossible, and it requested special efforts from people. For instance, they were awarded by the party or by leadership of the factories special tours to Poland. It was a prize, it was something to strive for. So the border formed this, it framed this picture of vision of the world, basically, in a way, in ideological terms, in terms of values, and in terms of security. One of the things which really scared a lot of people, both in Soviet camp and outside of it, of course, was the notion of the nuclear war. But I remember that for us kids, for instance, the discussion about it was specifically frightening because missiles do not observe borders. They should not cross it by land. They will just fly. And we remember that it takes 7 minutes for the missile to go from the American base, not in the US, but on European territory, to arrive to Moscow. So it's just to draw a picture, as anecdotal as it is, of the notion of the border, which I was used to when I was raised, when I grew up, And then, of course, everything changed, certainly. Notions of the borders between Soviet Socialist republics inside the USSR was basically non-existent. It didn't matter. No one I know really was conscious about crossing the border from Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic into Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic. No one really thought about it. These borders were not visible, they were not felt, they did not exist, as a matter of fact. So since 1991, things changed, and borders where they used to be started to melt, and borders where they did not exist started to be raised. And this was, in a way, it was a shock for Soviet population, not necessarily in negative terms. It was just a sea change, because for many people, especially those who were born and raised in the USSR, borders felt like something very natural. They were there forever, despite very well-known history of change in borders. But for people like me, we didn't really think about it. And the notion of the border was reconsidered. There was a period in time, especially at the beginning of the 90s, when Ukraine and Ukrainian population, straight after voting for independence in December 1991, started to try to imagine its future. And this is when notions of Ukraine as a neutral state, as a nuclear-free state, and just to remind you, Ukraine is the only state in the world with huge nuclear arsenal, which gave it up basically for free, with no obligations attached, like serious ones, I mean. And another thing which was discussed was that Ukraine will be the country in the heartland of Europe, like wider Europe, loved by everyone and enjoying all positive things, neighboring very different countries. First among them was freedom of movement. Suddenly people could exercise freedom of movement. They could cross the borders which were yesterday impenetrable. They could go to Poland and to Slovakia and to Czech Republic and to Hungary. And this coincided with the beginning of this terrible dark time in 90s, huge economic and social crisis, when 1994 was first really shocking year for many. And this, of course, gave prominence to new practices, which were first practiced by population living in the border areas and then spread around the country. First one of them was cross-border trade, which took massive scale. A lot of people went to neighboring Western and Southern countries, to Poland and to Hungary and to Czechoslovakia and then Slovakia and Czech Republic and to Turkey, by the way, to bring back goods and to sell them. And second phenomena, which is very prominent and extremely important for Ukraine, and specifically for some regions inside Ukraine, is labor migration. At first, people who lived and live in urban areas, in big cities, started to go abroad to work, and then it spread more into the countryside, and nowadays, according to Ukrainian researchers, the vast majority of Ukrainian labor migrants are people from the countryside. And also it's interesting that when you look at the numbers, however inconclusive they are, I mean official statistics, it started with mostly western regions of Ukraine, but then it spread into the central and eastern regions of Ukraine. People went abroad to work from all areas, and starting with the end of 90s, labor migration trends were split almost equally. 50% of those who went abroad to work went to Russian Federation, and another 50% went to Central and Western European states. And with next year's number or percentage of those who went to Russia actually started to diminish very slowly, but at least if to be based on Ukrainian migration researchers' data, they were able to show that, and more people started to join their compatriots, mostly their friends or their neighbors in their villages who already went to work in the EU countries. But still, at least until 1998, 1999, Ukrainians enjoyed relatively visa-free regime with almost all their neighbors. This really helped and supported a lot of people economically, and then it came to an end, started to come to an end very quickly. Most of Western neighboring states introduced visa regimes with Ukraine by or in the year 2000, and the reason was one and very simple: prospective membership in the European Union. And it was another shock for a big chunk of Ukrainian population, but this time it was quite negative. I remember even Visa quoted in works of migration researchers statements of officials and NGOs from Poland who already regarded itself by that time as main advocate of Ukraine in Central and Western Europe, that Poland will try not to introduce visa regime, and then next step was it will introduce visa regime, but it will be kind of soft and merciful, and then it had to be acknowledged that there will be no difference. Another comment was that it's not about interests of Polish leadership or Poland as a state, it is about the demands of the European Union for the prospective membership. It changed practices of the cross-border trade. Of course, it diminished and it never could recover. It still exists until now, but more and more in forms of smuggling. However, surprisingly, it did not affect that much labor migration. The first huge surge in migration movements in the area when it comes to Ukraine was between 1992 and 1995 and 6. And when it comes to labor migration, by the year 2000, routes of labor migration were already in place. Practices of joining families or bringing friends and neighbors were already in place. So it became more difficult for Ukrainians who wanted to go abroad westwards to do so, more expensive. They had more often used illegal means of doing so, but they still did. And currently, when we talk about labor migration, we can hardly say that further strengthening of the border regime or visa regime brought fruits in terms of selecting between undesirable Ukrainians, desirable Ukrainians who could be allowed to come and work. So, freedom of movement as a fact at the western borders came to an end, but there were practices there already in place who assisted to exercise it if people really needed to do so. At the same time, a few colleagues in Ukraine mentioned in their works that when it comes to the border itself, the western borders were the same where Soviet external borders were previously, so their very existence was never questioned. They were regarded more as a nuisance and as an obstacle, but they were there, while northern and eastern borders of Ukraine in a certain way lacked legitimacy. It's not in a political sense that they were seen as something to be removed, no, but in very everyday life, meaning when people crossed these international borders without thinking of them as of international borders, and suddenly could not do so because they lacked certain documents or because they brought their child who lacked certain documents or because of something else, a lot of them were really surprised. How comes those borders were not there? So by that time, already the border was not something that protected population. It was not a mean of security. It was not the dividing line between good and evil. It was regarded rather as an obstacle, as a nuisance, and as something that should be there, but to be felt as least as possible by those who are crossing it, at least those who live in the countries divided by this border. Basically, the Soviet image of the border was turned upside down. And the same came about the border guards. Ukrainian Border Guard Service, starting with 1991, was a military institution headed by the State Committee of the State Border. This was an official title. It was quite Soviet-like. In 1994, somehow legitimizing the turn of the image of the border, Ukraine adopted the law which was called about citizens of Ukraine leaving Ukraine and entering Ukraine. And main substance of the law and the beginning of it was that all Ukrainian nationals can freely leave Ukraine and can freely come back to Ukraine. Now it sounds a bit absurd, it's a natural thing, but in 1994, after the Soviet Union period, it was a very significant step. But Ukrainian borders changed even during the period of this relative freedom of movement, and even more so after the wave of enlargement of the European Union, especially when it came to the western borders. And this time the border was enforced, but was enforced from the outside, by the European institutions, by Frontex, by the border guard services of new EU neighbors, new EU members which were neighbors of Ukraine. And Ukrainian State Border Guard Service was in big part funded by the EU programs, also on the eastern and northern border. And part of this program was transformation of the Border Guard Service, which in 2003 became from the military basically the separate police institution. And it was formulated this way, that from now on the main functions of the border guards is policing, in the first place counteracting so-called illegal migration. Ukrainian leadership felt very strong political pressure from the EU when it comes to the issue of irregular migration into the European Union. And this led to closure of the western border of Ukraine, but this time from the outside. And as I mentioned, northern and eastern borders were still there, dividing states rather formally than as a matter of fact, if persons were not engaged in economic activity on a business scale. And of course, things changed in most recent era, which now seems to be already era, last 1 year and a half, which started since November 2013, protests at Maidan Square in Kiev, which was also called, this protest was called Euromaidan. It was triggered by the discussion about association between Ukraine and the European Union. It caused a lot of questions among our international colleagues, but among the protesters who had positive idea about European Union, two main things mattered. First, Europe was associated with the notion of rights, civic rights and civic liberties, fight with corruption and non-discrimination, and second, of course, freedom of movement. When Ukrainians during surveys said that they would like Ukraine to join the EU, one of the main reasons for that was that they expected Ukrainian nationals finally to enjoy freedom of movement on a scale they enjoyed in the 90s and more. So freedom of movement was not only desirable, it was an ideal and it was a goal. And it was actually one of the goals of Maidan protests as well. But we see that the following events actually brought different perspective due to the Russian military intervention and war, which followed, and it did so in probably slightly surprising way. It tried to distance oneself from what's happening, at least in the east of Ukraine. We can see that recent year brought back to Ukrainians as a nation, as a community, notion of the border as a dividing line which provides security, which should defend Ukrainians from aggressor, and it brought back this image of the border guard being a hero who protects the community, the country, etc. It is not really surprising given the fact that main events started with the breach of the border in Crimea first and then in the east, and with war going on in the east of Ukraine, and borders again serve their military functions, which never happened since 1991 in Ukraine. But even more, they are regarded again as separating different communities with different sets of values and providing certain security. Maybe one of the most striking example of that is, from my very subjective point of view, quite weird project of building the wall at the border between Ukraine and Russia, like a proper wall, proper fortification, very Soviet style, but more high-tech, which was introduced by Ukrainian government September last year. Despite Ukraine being in huge economic crisis currently, it is already partially funded. And it obviously has more symbolic and ideological meaning and image than a practical defense one, especially given the fact that Ukrainian authorities still do not control part of the border, which is controlled by pro-Russian armed groups in the east of Ukraine. And the same comes with images of border guards who died in the fight against pro-Russian combatants, whose names are now used in their native villages. Streets are named after them. Surprisingly enough, we can see that at the another coil of the spiral, some very Soviet elements of very belonging to modernity, to Soviet modernity, elements are brought back into the current Ukrainian situation by actions and aspirations and politics of political leadership of Russian Federation. On the other hand, we see that with the beginning of hostilities in Ukraine, armed hostilities, the visa and border regime with the EU countries is even more tightened and strengthened by the EU countries recently, which is not surprising. Ukraine has more than 1,300,000 internally displaced persons currently, and about 1 million persons who left Ukrainian territory trying to find even temporary asylum elsewhere. And also it's quite obvious that since war brought social and economic crisis to Ukraine, prospects of increase in labor migration from Ukraine are quite real. So we see this quite sad picture of Ukraine with its Ukraine, I now more say about population or community rather than state or political leadership, with all its aspirations to freedom of movement as an idea which partially triggered protests and recent revolution, turns slowly into enclave, being enclosed from the West by the European Union, and which desperately tries to enclose itself from the north and east due to the very security reasons, but also having values and ideas background in this picture. And what we also have, last but not least, we see that the notion of the border changes in one more way. We now have internal borders, which did not exist before, and which are not proper borders in the exact meaning of the word, but not from legal, but from very practical and everyday point of view, they serve as the borders. I mean, in the first place, administrative border between the mainland Ukraine and occupied territories of Crimean Peninsula. It is not recognized as the state border by the Ukrainian government, but since beginning of June, actually since 3rd of June, if I'm not mistaken, this year, it is operated only by State Border Guard Service of Ukraine, and new rules introduced less than a month ago at the entry to Crimean Peninsula by Ukrainian government actually make it even more difficult to cross for non-Ukrainian nationals than the state border. So, not being a state border officially, it reminds me that I have come to an end. Not being a state border officially, it serves as a border, even more border than the state border. And we have another border in the east with the territories occupied by Russian troops and pro-Russian insurgents. Again, recent introduction of new rules of crossing the so-called line of fighting, no one calls it front line for some reason, makes it really difficult for people to cross this non-existent line. It does not exist on the map, but it exists in reality. Just one, and the last one example, I've recently been to liberated areas of Donetsk region, to towns of Konstantinovka and Dzerzhinsk. Dzerzhinsk is at the very front line. So local taxi drivers complained to me that they never had in their life drive their taxi cab in their country carrying passport on them all of the time, because they can be stopped by military any single moment, and they have to cross roadblocks and present their papers inside Ukrainian territory. Basically, we face comeback of border zones, or border regime, which was explained by Sabine, but not in the Soviet meaning, not exactly in Soviet form, with another twist. And I remember going to Dzerzhinsk, which is at the front line. I passed the roadblock with the sign, Ukraine Border Guard Service, you are leaving Ukraine. Dzerzhinsk is under control of Kiev, but this town is in this gray zone belonging to practically not clear to whom. So this border is very difficult to penetrate, and it leads to not only to problems for those who try to leave occupied territories, or journalists and volunteers who try to help population there. Sometimes it leads to tragedies. So basically, I don't think I have to make any conclusion here. It is also, I hope it is too early to call. Ukrainian situation is in development, but as a trend, we see this hierarchy of borders being installed by outside actors, or due to actions of the mostly outside actors. And Ukrainian authorities responding to the new challenges in a very Soviet-like way. Last time they used borders as security mean, they faced it in Soviet Union, so they bring back these practices. And we see that aspirations for freedom of movement and non-discrimination are in practice replaced by hierarchy of borders and more discriminatory situation. As long as the war goes on, it doesn't seem to end. Thank you. Well, when it comes to refugees and when it comes to internally displaced persons, I specifically didn't mention refugees in this picture. Refugees, I mean international ones. However, the current situation in Ukraine and this spiral of the border construction definitely affects them, and it leads sometimes to tragedies. It just happened to be so that before we specialized on, not specialized, but most of refugees seeking asylum in Ukraine who turned to our group organization. They came from post-Soviet countries, and most of them crossed into Ukraine via Russian-Ukrainian border, and some of them in irregular way. Now it is much more difficult, of course, and therefore, and strengthening of the border, and also new rules of entry into Ukraine, which would be unthinkable of 2 years ago. They would be a scandal. Like Russian nationals can use only external international passports to enter Ukraine. 2 years ago it would not be possible. Now it is taken for granted. So it leaves a lot of people without even a possibility to try to find asylum. When it comes to internally displaced persons, of course, the reaction is very mixed. We observe mostly spirit of solidarity. It's much better than we expected, because in first month after occupation of Crimea and beginning of armed conflict in the east, it felt to be quite natural, but then tiredness and economic crisis, of course, had to take its toll. But still, most of those we talked to, they express solidarity with IDPs, internally displaced persons, and it can be moral support, or it can be very tangible financial support, bringing clothes or food, or giving money or something else. But at the same time, of course, we see negative trends, and they vary. In regions which are more distant from the front line, there are trends in discriminating IDPs from war regions, mostly due to big distance from the front line. It is quite often formulated, our guys from our western Ukrainian region die in the eastern front line, and you come here to, and then you have it, take our jobs, take social assistance from the state, do this and do that. In eastern regions which border the front line, more social and economic issues are at stake. The more IDPs are in the region, the more difficult it is not to let the living standards crash. Prices are higher, prices for renting a flat are difficult to bear, and of course other negative consequences are felt. There are some instances of discrimination in media as well, but overall it is rather an expression of solidarity, and it is also very interesting. Until now it does not make a difference on which linguistic group or which social class arrivals and hosting communities mostly belong to. So I think when a lot of people state that Ukrainians feel now themselves being rather civic and political entity, national, call it community, despite language differences, they have a point, and we see it when it comes to treatment of IDPs in different regions of Ukraine.